What if the family portrait on the wall was painted with lies? What if silence itself could be honed into a blade? And what truly happened that night in Mississippi when fire devoured a grand house and a name vanished from its ledgers? This is the story of Malachi of Ebo, and of vengeance that breathes through Ashdod. The Willoughby plantation slept under the crushing weight of its own. Husha hush, not of peace but of suffocation. Buried in the belly of Mississippi, it nestled among ancient cypress and the breathless vapors of the swamp. Insects hummed like faint jurors. The soil, heavy and black, remembered what men tried to bury. Malachi had not been born at Willoughby, but it received him the way a coffin receives a body, without ceremony, without choice. He was tall, his shoulders weathered like old bark. He worked the earth with the steadiness of a man who had learned that, here, survival had to be quieter than resistance. By day he obeyed the overseer's nods. By night he sat beside Ebo, his wife, under the slatted shadows of their quarters and said little. Their silence was a sacrament. Their eyes did the speaking. Ebo carried a stillness that scared even the others. Her past clung to her like soot. Some swore she had once bitten a man's throat to stop what was coming. Others whispered she had sung to a dying child until the fever took her voice instead. No one knew. She rarely spoke. Vivian Willoughby, the widow ruling the estate, wielded a gaze like morning frost. Her cruelty was never loud. It was polished smiling while wrists were bound. After her husband died, she announced that Willoughby would not rot like so many places. Order would be preserved, she said, by devotion and loyalty. By loyalty she meant obedience. By devotion, surrender. One morning she summoned Malachi to the drawing room. Stern men and brittle women peered down from the walls, oil faces witnessing an unnamed horror. She offered him cruelty poured into a porcelain cup and spoke, as if she were making small talk. My sons, she said, nodding toward two pale, wiry boys in the garden, need a father's discipline. A man's hand. You, Malachi, have a certain gravity. He did not reply. He did not move. You will guide them, she continued, sipping, and I will tend to you all as though you were my own. This is not punishment, it is elevation. He bowed the way a man bows to a descending blade. From that day, Malachi was pulled from the fields and made to orbit the manor. He taught the boys to fish, to carve, to pray. While he did, Ebo watched from behind a curtain of quiet, feeding them, dressing them, wiping their mouths as if they were not the offspring of her captor. Every task was a cut that left no blood. Among the quarters, the new arrangement puzzled some. A few envied his removal from the rows. Others smelled rot. Beneath the perfume, Vivian began calling them my family. She commissioned a portrait, a grotesque tableau of inclusion. Malachi at her side, Ebo behind, the boys before them, all in oils laid on as thick as deceit. At night, Malachi lay beside Ebo, listening to the swamp breathe through the cracks. She wouldn't speak, she only stared. One evening her fingers closed around his wrist, not with affection, not from fear. A signal. Wordless, as always, something was breaking or about to. Dark, thickened like sap. Cypress knees rose from the water like knuckles. A murmur threaded the reeds. Ebo heard it first not as sound, but as pressure behind the ribs, a pulse, knocking at bone, asking entrance. Days stretched under a counterfeit peace. Malachi guided the boys in that measured tone that makes prayer and warning sound the same. Vivian praised the order of things, the cleanliness of schedules, the tidy way sorrow could be folded into linen and put away. But each dusk, when smoke thinned, Ebo stood at the edge of the quarters and faced the water. Her silence changed color. It was no longer absence, it was listening. The murmur moved on the surface, a lace of words that didn't belong to the houses. Tongue. It came from before the house, before the road, from a place without a map. Malachi watched her the way one watches an approaching storm, the way animals feel thunder before a cloud appears. He tried to speak gently, to crack the brittle shell around her. She turned her face. In her eyes he saw nocturnal daylight, no reflection, only depth. Uma, the oldest among them, moved with the certainty of roots, his back bent beneath the weight of names. He sat with Malachi by a dying fire and spoke in threads. The earth is a sleepwalker, he said. It moves while pretending to rest. It will cradle a tyrant so long as silence holds, but it will roll and unseat him the moment a true word is uttered. The word is not with the mouth, it is with the spine. Vivian increased her visits to the quarters, smiling with porcelain ease, sure of her own righteousness. She touched Ebo's shoulder like a blessing that remembered to sting, reminding her of duties, buttons to fasten, bruises to ignore, lullabies to hum for other women's children. Ebo's breath shortened, but she bowed. The bow was shallow. The murmur lifted. On a Sabbath afternoon the boys quarreled over a fishing lure. One pushed, the other fell. Blood ticked from a lip. Malachi separated them with a calm that hid a tremor. From the porch, Vivian watched like a parishioner, admiring. Good liturgy. She called it harmony. Malachi felt the word catch in his throat like a broken fishbone. That night Ebo spoke a single syllable in an unnamed tongue, and the frogs went still. Uma turned his head as if a door had opened behind him. The fire hissed and fell to a red seam. A shape passed through the QAnon hurry, dragging memory like a net. Uma's legend woke. The soil, he said, remembers footsteps and debts. Rivers keep ledgers. Cypress roots study faces. A wrong left unspoken multiplies in the dark, and returns heavier like water lifting a drowned tree. To break the spell, call the earth by its true name and let it decide. Malachi slept without sleeping, thoughts fluttering like trapped birds. He had learned obedience by cutting it into swallowable pieces. Each new piece lodged harder than the last. He held Ebo's hand and felt a quiet fever heat that didn't burn skin so much as mark it with resolve. Before dawn, wind braided itself through the moss and the swamp exhaled. Ebo rose, washed her hands, and tied her headscarf with deliberate care. She did not look at him. She didn't need to. The murmur had become a vow. The morning of the portrait arrived in pale, reluctant light, as though the sun itself hesitated to be seen over Willoughby. Vivian dressed her small court in finery, coaxing order from cloth the way one coaxes lies into a pleasant shape. Ebo was forced into silk that didn't belong to her life, a color the swamp would never forgive. Malachi stood where he was placed, still as the artist murmured about balance and dignity, mixing paint the way a priest mixes doctrine. Hours passed in frozen acceptance. The boys fidgeted, then learned steadiness by counting Malachi's breaths. Vivian smiled with a saint's serenity carved in salt, brilliant and brittle. Ebo's eyes gave no reflection. The artist paused there, stirred, then brushed anyway, varnishing terror into gloss. When the sitting ended, Vivian called the canvas proof of grace. The word rattled through the house like an empty cup. That evening came guest splanters from neighboring counties, men who scented weakness the way hounds catch a trail. Among them arrived Vivian's brother Lucian, an urban polish laid like varnish over warped wood. He praised the estate's chain of command, the cleanliness from order to obedience. His laughter had the weight of hands. After supper, Lucian found Ebo alone near the storehouse where corn dust floated like pale fog. He spoke as though discussing the weather, as though her body were a porch post to lean against. Ebo kept silence as one hides a blade behind the back. When his voice dropped private, Malachi stepped from shadow with a firmness that did not need volume. The moment balanced on a reed. Lucian smiled without mirth and summoned men. What followed was not a lesson but a ritual. Malachi absorbed fists and boots with the grim arithmetic of necessity. He did not fall quickly. That refusal enraged them more than open defiance. By morning he moved like a cracked bell, still sounding, but in a new note no one could ignore. Vivian called it an unfortunate misunderstanding. The boys were told to forget. Ebo didn't weep. Her face was so emptied it almost glowed. She vanished that night. In the quarters, whispers coiled around snakes and grief and the hunger of the water. The swamp took her into its lungs and did not return her for 3 days. Uma said only the earth had given her a room for listening. On the second dusk, thunder walked the horizon without rain. On the third dawn, Ebo stepped back over the threshold like a tide finding its chosen shore. A hush walked with her, lifting the hairs on forearms. She resumed work as if resuming a prayer, paused mid-syllable. In the storage loft, the portrait dried. Paint settled into its final lies. One afternoon a crack crept across the varnish from the Baroness's smile to the corner where Ebo stood. A thin white seemed like frost over a wound. No one claimed to have touched it. Passing below, Malachi felt a shift in the beams, a new weight in the air, as if the house inhaled and decided against exhaling. That night the swamp's murmur rose and braided to Ebo's breathing. Malachi understood. Patience can be sharpened. Dusk bled into the trees. The house settled on its creaking spine, counting comforts like a miser counts coins. Malachi moved through hours as if measuring them with string. Not by not he learned the estate's rhythms the way a hunter learns prey's breathing. When the overseer's pipe went cold, when the kitchen quieted, when the dogs turned in sleep and forgot the scent of fear. Ebo watched without speaking, her gaze a lantern that cast no light and revealed everything. The cracked portrait waited like a prophecy in a box of dust. It taught Malachi a private lesson. Polish splits, raw wood shows. He tested small hinges of order. A latch, loosened, then restored a key, borrowed long enough to learn its language. A door that squealed for everyone but him. He practiced patience, until it felt like a blade wrapped in cloth. One of the boys, the younger, wandered farther each afternoon, rehearsing bravery to impress a mother who loved poise more than warmth. He dared the old well's lip, where a rope dangled like a promise. Malachi warned him in the same tone he used for prayer. The child laughed clean, unknowing privilege. On a day of swollen heat, the laughter didn't come back. The bucket chain clattered and fell still. A silence dropped too heavy for accident. The estate shuddered in its manners. Vivian's grief arranged itself quickly into blame, then into performance. Malachi said nothing. Ebo stood in the threshold, hands closed, while the swamp held its breath like a word just before it spoken. Night gathered. Uma whispered the ledger had turned a page. Vivian cinched rules until the rooms hissed with them. Lanterns burned late. Watchmen walked in pairs, eyes always pulling toward the place where the boys' laugh used to live. Malachi's face altered. Nothing inside him. A clock ticked. No one else could hear. With each tick he studied angles, stair to corridor, pantry to cellar, parlor to nursery. Fire, he knew, doesn't argue. it decides. On the third night, air lay thick as wool. The swamp sent a scent of iron and rain that never arrived. Ebo tied her scarf in a sailor's knot and set her palm on the floorboards. She drew one deep breath, and finally spoke. The words were few and soft, shaped by a far country, and heavy with verdict. "The earth," she said, "has awakened." Malachi lifted a lamp. Oil shifted like a dark eye. He walked with the unhurried certainty of someone stepping into a story already written, past sleeping rooms of power, past portraits that stared through walls. He did not look back. Ebo followed as far as the veranda and stayed not as a widow at a grave, but as a judge waiting for the jury's return. The dogs did not rise. Crickets kept count. Distance became a map he'd drawn in blood. Linen closet to curtain, curtain to door, door to the room where Vivian kept her altar to orderlies, ribbons, polished keys. He touched nothing except what welcomed flamecloth whispered. Oil agreed. The lamp lowered like a confession freed from a throat. A mouse skittered through Providence. He paused once beside a cradle holding no child. The emptiness rang. It wasn't mercy that stayed his hand there. It was recognition. Some rooms punish themselves. He moved on. Before the first lick of heat, he heard Ibo's breath reach him as if carried through a long reed of water. It steadied his bones. The match struck without drama. A small son was born in a house that had hoarded night. The wick accepted its fate. Smoke wrote its opening sentence. Malachi stepped back into the corridor. The lamp felt lighter for having shared its burden. He walked toward the front as the house exhaled for the first time in years, and the sigh had edges. At midnight, the house discovered its true size. Fire measured it by breath and beam, licking along cornices as though reading scripture that lay in dust for years. Timbers sighed, then yielded with a gratitude that sounded like grief. Heat unstitched curtains. Glass found a language older than windows and knelt. Somewhere a piano shed its lacquer, showing ribs, singing one thin last note before silence cupped a palm over its mouth. Vivian moved through those rooms as if pomp could bargain with flame. She shouted names that once rushed to answer. The halls ran backward from her voice. In the loft, the portrait cracked wide along its earlier seam. Color curled, lifting like leaves in wind. The painted children kept their delicate smiles while varnish blistered. Ibo's likeness held steady, unblinking, until smoke folded it to sleep. The overseer woke choking cinders, ran, stopped, ran again, unsure which order to save. Men formed bucket lines that delivered emptiness, curses that arrived late. The dogs lay with muzzles on paws and watched the arithmetic conclude. Ebo stood at the rail and blinking. Her face neither hardened nor softened. It held the shape of a verdict already read. When the roof fell and the staircase folded into amber ruin, Malachi stepped out through a seam fire hadn't claimed. Soot masked his features or revealed them. He looked neither left nor right. He passed the garden where children's footprints had dried like fossils, the well that kept its counsel, and he entered the cypress air where the swamp received him the way night receives a long-expected whisper. Some said he walked a hummocked path known only to the dead. Others swore. He paused, lifted a hand toward the veranda and lowered it as if blessing an unseen congregation. By dawn the estate smoked like the last ember of a sermon. Rooms were reduced to pronouns. Here once, there, never again. Guests from the outbuildings wore ash like penance and avoided Ebo's eyes. The Baroness's body was not found, though fragments of her kingdom lay everywhere, keys fused to ribbon, a ring welded to a bone-white plate, a ledger charred at the edges but legible in its sums. Uma turned each page with a fingertip and nodded as if a balance long entered had finally cleared. Neighbors arrived with wagons of advice and a geometry of blame. Lawmen circled and asked how a blaze outruns feet, how watchmen see nothing, how water loses one boy and refuses to give up his twin to understanding. Ebo answered with exactly enough words to be human and free. Her silences filled in the rest, with an authority no badge could interrupt. When they asked for Malachi, she said, "The earth does not return what it chooses to keep." The quarters became a small republic of ash and caution. Ebo organized bread and bandage, taught the littlest how to wash smoke from hair with vinegar and patience, listened to nightmares until sleep learned to lie down without teeth. She buried the keys at the foot of a cypress where the mud shone like a sealed eye. She often sat at the threshold as if pouring something invisible from one world into another, and those who stood near her left with steadier hands. Sightings grew like moss, a figure at dusk by the levee, a shape crossing a flooded field where no dry ground lay, prints on a sandbar facing upstream. Uma said the swamp was writing a psalm, and Malachi was the refrain. Children began leaving small offerings, a fish scale, a button, a headless nail arranged in patient circles that foxes stepped around. When rain finally came, it fell without thunder, a slow baptism. The soil took it in with a sound like consent. Ebo walked the black edge of the foundation and pressed her palm to the ash until it cooled under her skin. Her voice returned not as song but as decree, spare and exact, a language that understood ledgers and ghosts alike. She spoke the names of those made small and set them upright again, syllable by syllable. They say there are nights when the veranda gathers weight under steps that cannot be seen, when laughter rises from the well and ends before it can be recognized, when the air smells of lacquer and wet rope and then clears. On those nights the land retells its account in the quiet register of leaves brushing together. The ashes answer, as softly as breath. Listen long enough and the story never ends. It circles, rescued by wind and water, each time closing on a truth no fire can erase.